Hey, Kate, welcome to the Happy Healthy Caregiver podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I just finished your book this weekend, so I'm delighted. It's very fresh for me. Sometimes I talk to people and it's like, oh, I hope I can remember what I read. But I wanted to first thank the Circle of app team. They're the ones that really suggested that I read your book and that I talk to you, because I think we're both mentioned as resources in the Circle of Caregiving app. So we always link to different helpful things. We'll link to them in the show notes. And I just, encourage people who are listening, if you've got somebody that you think that we need to have on the show, I'd love to hear about it. Your book was very refreshing and awesome. First of all, it's so pretty for a caregiving book, like Already Toast. I love the title, and Caregiving and Burnout in America. And we're going to talk all about this. I think this book is fabulous. But first, we have a little bit of a rhythm to our show. We start things with pulling something from the Happy Healthy Caregiver jar, which was something that I used to just encourage caregivers out there. And there's now a refill pack, so we'll link to that as well. But when I first get your thoughts on this, Kate, it says, the future depends on what we do in the present. And that's a Gandhi quote, actually. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, I think that's a really rich topic for caregiving and could go in so many different directions. On an individual level, I think so many people have caregiving in their future and don't really know it and aren't prepared for it. And so I really like to encourage people to think about caregiving as something that will likely come to them, whether they're expecting it now or not. It certainly came to me at a time when I wasn't expecting it and didn't feel prepared. And so I think for a lot of people, just getting in the mindset of preparing in the present for a future that will include caring for loved ones is going to change that experience later on. And then on a more macro and systemic level, because one of the things I really tried to do in the book always is point to the systemic issues surrounding caregiving and how our systems could be better supporting caregiving. Right now is this real inflection point and opportunity in the US for our systems to do better regarding caregiving. We're looking right now at implementing paid leave on a federal level, which would be a huge step forward for caregivers. So I think there's a lot of things in our present that could be done to ease care, both for individuals and for all caregivers everywhere in our future.
Yeah, our future selves will be thanking us if we can get on board with some of the things that we know are coming. Like, that's the thing, it's not even a surprise, like the data is there. So I was blessed with your story in the book, but for those that are listening, tease them a little bit, tell them a little bit about your caregiving journey and your sandwich generation, and how that came about for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really not thinking about caregiving when I became a caregiver. I actually had always expected to care for my mom, who had a lot of health problems and who lived in the same city as me. But unfortunately, she passed away much younger than expected when my kids were really young. And so I was just thinking of caring for others in terms of parenting. And then my husband, when we were in our 40s, I was 42, he was 44, he started to lose weight really steadily. I noticed he was like falling asleep at like 7 o'clock while we were like waiting to put our kids to bed. And it was like, that's unusual. And then one day, actually, it was right when my younger daughter was starting kindergarten. And I was thinking like, oh, I've made it to the elementary school years. I'm going to have more time to work, et cetera. Because I'm a freelance writer and have been for a long time. My husband came into the kitchen and he's always worn a beard, and he was like touching his jawline and he says, I have these weird lumps on my jaw. Do you think I should go to the doctor? And I kind of looked and I thought, oh, he's lost weight and all of this. It was really nagging in my head. And I said, you should absolutely go to the doctor. And it took about 6 months actually to get a diagnosis of a very rare T-cell lymphoma for him. And I wasn't really thinking of myself as a caregiver during that time, even though I was, starting to research. I was accompanying him to appointments. I was taking notes. I was doing a lot of traditional caregiving roles. And there was a lot of ambiguity around his diagnosis and treatment. This was all, that was in the spring of 2015 when he was diagnosed. And then it turned really quickly. It turned aggressive. He went into really intense treatment and chemotherapy. I tell the story in much more detail, obviously, in the book. He also relapsed really, really quickly and headed straight into a stem cell transplant within less than a year of diagnosis. And that was where the caregiving journey got incredibly intense. He was hospitalized for 4.5 months. He lost his vision. He lost his ability to eat. He couldn't see the kids for 3 months. And he came home when I was already worn out from a year of caregiving at home and in the hospital. And the doctor told me, when he comes home, he can't be left alone even for a moment. And I was like, how am I supposed to do that? Like, I have 2 kids. We had family help. We had community support. We had the things that caregivers need. And it still just felt overwhelming and impossible. And we made it through. He made it through. He eventually recovered his vision with surgery. He's still disabled and has chronic illness as a complication of that stem cell transplant, but is doing much better than the time I wrote about in the book.
Right.
So that's the overview.
That's a good overview. And I'm glad to hear that the trajectory is getting better. Sometimes when folks are caregiving, it's slowly decline. And you brought up that doctor conversation, but that was one of the parts in the book that just made me so angry was, and again, it's already toast, caregiving and burnout in America. But when Brad, your husband, was discharged and you talked about that and you were kind of wanting like practical wisdom and advice from this doctor. And I pulled the quote. It says, usually family steps in and it works out fine. Like, oh, it's going to be fine. Like, no, that would have been the perfect time. Like for me, I'm thinking that would have been the perfect time for him to give you a caregiver resource sheet, introduce you to local support group, give you a number for a caregiving coach, or even just a grief support because you're dealing with so much loss. And I don't know, I just feel like the healthcare system that's a baby step. Like we got big problems, but there's some baby step opportunities there.
I think there are some real opportunities for the healthcare system to jump in and to recognize what they're asking of family caregivers and how few the resources and supports often are for people, and the way I look at it too, it's like I had a lot of privilege going into that situation. I did not have to be working full time. It would have been far more impossible if I were. I did have family support, though my husband's family was with us and they live in Canada. So they were actually bumping up against like how long they could stay in the country and help us. But they were an amazing support for us. But, the hospital puts you in touch with a social worker who knows how many hundreds of people on their caseload. Just the resources that are out there are often so strapped, and it's so much work to find them for a family caregiver who is also incredibly strapped that, I think the healthcare system does, as you say, have some opportunities to provide that support, especially given how immensely they rely on family caregivers. When Brad was discharged, the amount of medical care that he needed at home that was suddenly my job was overwhelming. It was a lot.
You didn't have any, nursing training or anything like that. And then you'd also mentioned in that part too about the impact, like you must be pretty environmentally conscious. I have a 21-year-old daughter she's like our resident for change for the environment in our household. And that was something that I never thought about before. It's just all the waste that comes with what you were dealing with. You were just seeing it all pile up, and then it must have bothered you. But at some point you probably were like, I can't worry about that right now.
I mean, it is a little bothersome, and you can't worry about it because there are more urgent problems. But our recycling pickup comes every 2 weeks. And when you're getting like big, huge boxes full of plastic tubing and syringes and all of those things, it becomes a disposal problem, just like an extra little practical thing that's one more step for the individual caregivers to take care of. Breaking down those boxes gets frustrating.
It was a lot. It's a lot. And then the other thing I found to be kind of unexpectedly fun, frankly, about the book was you put a lot of references into classic literature like Little Women and Jane Eyre. And now that I know a bit about your background, it makes sense that that's in there. But I'm assuming that these caregiver roles didn't stick out like sore thumbs to you until after you became a caregiver.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I should explain for listeners. So I do have an academic background in Victorian literature. I got my PhD in Victorian literature. That's where I met my husband, who was a professor of English literature before he became ill and had to retire. Um, but so I'd read these books like Jane Eyre and Middlemarch for years and before and after graduate school. And so honestly, I kind of returned to them when I was caregiving because they were familiar and comforting, and like to reread Little Women or reread the Anne of Green Gables series felt like this I can concentrate on. I couldn't concentrate on much, but like that I could. And so it took me away from my reality, but I also suddenly realized that there were these caregiving stories that I'd really overlooked in these books for years. And it struck me as so telling about how we as a culture kind of overlook caregivers in general. And they also were, I thought, really revealing about like the cultural roles of caregivers, the expectations, especially on women to provide care, the norms that we have around caring. And so it was really important to me to include those in the book and think about the questions around caregiving a little more broadly from a cultural point of view, as well as I look at the demographics and economics of caregiving, as well as my own personal story. So there's kind of these three strands of the book, but the literary strand kind of has my heart in it because it's so close to my background.
Yeah, well, and I like how, you were able to weave in a little bit of self-care into, there's a lot of waiting time in this
Mhm.
process. And so but the fact that you didn't necessarily go to a book that was brand new, but something that was comforting. And maybe if you put down and pick back up, you're like, oh, where was I again? Like you're already familiar with the story. And I love how you identified them with them because you felt like you were also unseen. You did write something in your book that said, I was not a person to them. I was an element of the patient's treatment. And I was like, yes, you're never really, I never even really was told like you're a family caregiver and here's what is expected of you. And yeah, you're just like, here's the wound care. Here's how you're going to deal with these different things. And it's frustrating.
Yeah, it does feel really frustrating. It feels like a real erasure of self at a lot of times. Some of my conflicts with, different care providers came about because I felt like I'm a person, like I have knowledge to bring to bear or experience or conflicts with this that just kind of were lost in the shuffle of them seeing me as like an instrument for caring for my husband, which, to be clear, of course I wanted him to get good care, but I felt like often there was such a high cost to me,
It was
a cost,
easier.
yeah, that it made it tough to do it willingly and to do it lovingly. And that I think is where the burnout starts to come in.
Mhm. One topic that we have yet, I don't think, to talk about on this podcast that you bring up in the book is this idea almost, and I read somebody's post today about it, like, hey, does anyone out there ever feel jealous of the care recipient or the caree because of, just doing everything for them? And you did touch on it a little bit when you were talking about how, not only were you caregiving and expected to do that, but you're managing more care for your young children and your own career. And so you said you had a little bit of jealousy about Brad's ability to write. Maybe talk about that a little bit.
Sometimes, yeah, when he came home from the hospital and he had lost his vision, and he had we were hiring somebody like a graduate student to help him with transcribing and with reading to him and helping him read his own work because he wasn't physically sighted and able to do it, and he hadn't learned some of the adaptive technologies because it was very unclear whether he was going to get his vision back. So, and he was so ill that tackling the adaptive technologies was kind of a challenge for him. um and so we were paying a person to come and help with this. And I did feel some jealousy because, I'm a writer too, and I wanted to be spending time writing, and I was spending 100% and then some of my time managing our household, making sure that things were running smoothly, taking the kids hither and thither and doing all of those things. And I felt like, oh, well, we're literally investing money in paying somebody to help him, and because he had time. And
Mhm.
I'm not saying that I wanted it to be taken away from him. I think that was an important part of his recovery. He wrote a lot of poetry about his illness, and that was and remains very important to him. But I wanted that time for myself as well, and I couldn't figure out how to claim it. Though I did stay in a writing group during the most intense phases of his illness, and some of the things that I scribbled down often to just meet a deadline for turning in pages to the writing group. Like, I would have my laptop at the hospital bedside and like write essentially what felt like a journal entry. And, some of those things actually in very different and revised form ended up in the book. So I did manage to keep a little slender thread of my writing life and that life alive, through his illness.
I just applaud you for like recognizing it and naming it, and and just reframing it and talking yourself out of it. And it's okay to feel that way. I'm glad that you found support through your writing group during that time too. I had someone else on the show, I think Anne Campanella, who talked about how her writing group, like sometimes traditional support groups, yeah, they're great, but that might not be the right fit for you. So wherever your people are, they
Mhm.
can, my book club was a big part of my support. Lots of tears and tissues in those meetings, while with, having this permission to read while I was in some of the intense areas of my life were great. Where when did you know you needed to write this book?
Oh, I think it grew gradually, but the first piece that I wrote that later became in different form a part of the book was actually about a caregiver figure in the Anne of Green Gables series and my own life. So it was kind of juxtaposed with, my own situation and this character's story. And I think it was in writing that essay, and when I placed that essay, it ran in Avidly, which is um, an online publication. And the reaction that I got to that from other caregivers of feeling seen, and it was a rough read of an essay, I would say. Not, I hope not in the writing format, but like in the feelings, and I did not hold back, and I got a lot of, pretty visceral response from other caregivers and people who had read it. And it really, that kind of helped me see the validity of the story and how much need there was for that kind of story and that kind of representation around caregiving. And of course, there are many great books out there. I felt when I was looking for things during my own caregiving time, I was finding more that focused on either practical how to's or kind of a more reflective stance, like, past caregiving. Often a lot of memoirs are written after loss, which is really sad and hard. But I think sometimes enables people to take a little bit more of a stance along the lines of like how worth it was to spend that last time with the loved one, which I would never ever want to discount. I wanted to tell a story about being in the thick of it and being in the messy, raw emotions that often come up in the middle of the caregiving journey, because I didn't see as much of that represented. And in some ways, I needed that kind of book when I was in it to feel like I wasn't a terrible person for feeling those feelings, right? Like, part of why I wanted to write the book was to give people, to mirror back to them a little bit of these negative emotions, these challenges. They're natural and real, and you don't have to pretend that they're not happening. And it doesn't make you a bad person or a bad caregiver to have those feelings and to struggle with this role, because it's a really hard role. And it's made harder by the fact that society kind of writ large doesn't do enough to support it. It's always going to be emotionally and physically, practically hard, but we could be making it less hard for people. And as a larger society, I think we're not. There are movements toward that, but not
Yeah,
enough.
I mean, if there are some silver linings from the pandemic, I think that that's one, is I feel like that's getting more attention.
I
The
agree.
employers are paying more attention, our government's paying more attention. It's you'd mentioned women, it's predominantly falls on women. I think 70% is the latest stat of caregiver. It's growing for
Mhm.
males to become the primary caregivers, but it's still a much female dominated
Yeah.
role. And I don't know if that goes why it's just, culturally and as a society, it's like, oh, well, that's what women do. I don't know. I hope that that's not it.
I think that's exactly it. I think that's a huge part, especially of why it's economically devalued, both in family caregiving and in paid caregiving, which is very much underpaid, insecure, and often, falls to some of our most vulnerable workers who often are exploited in the role of being paid caregivers. And I think that family caregiving is undervalued and indeed economically completely unvalued. It's not counted in GDP, et cetera, largely because it's thought of as women's work, and women's work is thought of as like a resource that society can draw upon endlessly. We saw this there's a similar dynamic, I think, with childcare, and we definitely saw that with childcare during the pandemic. And I think and hope it has, as you said, created an opportunity for change and more recognition of how difficult that dynamic is for individuals and how bad it is for society as a whole. Because what is a community, what is a society if not individuals who care for each other in particular ways? We all need care. It's part of everybody's lives,
Yeah.
and we need to set up systems that make it possible for people to do that well for their loved ones. Um, and I hope that we won't just go back to the before times without reckoning with this care crisis.
I hope not. I hope not as well. Toward the end of the book, or the last third of the book, you start talking about what the US is trying to do, some of the things that they're trying to do, what other countries are trying to do to help family caregivers. I mean, do you have a personal opinion on which direction you think, like, out of all of these things, like, where does it seem like what would have helped you the most?
Well, I do think for me, I was a freelance worker, so paid leave wouldn't have been as big a deal for me personally, but I think that would be a huge first step, and just a first step for caregivers generally. Especially women have to drop out of the workforce like much more than, far disproportionately to men, because of the lack of leave to care for their loved ones. Um, I think there's interesting promise in models around paying family caregivers directly, and there are some sectors in which that's possible. Some states, the landscape for that is complicated. Um, I think that tax credits might for caregiving could really help a lot of people and could offset some of the like really significant out of pocket costs that caregivers put out on caring for their loved ones. I think the latest stat I saw is that it's an average of $7,000
Yeah, that's
a
what I
year. I personally, that sounds low to me. It's lower than it was for me, but I guess that's why it's an average. Um, Honestly, I think if we had universal health care and a fully not for profit healthcare system, it would be huge for caregivers and care recipients alike. Like, part of the reason the burden on family caregivers has grown so immensely over the last, few decades is that people are discharged needing really significant care at home. And one of the ways hospitals and healthcare systems have cut costs is by putting that on family caregivers. That those medicalized tasks that many family caregivers, including myself, are really shocked to be like, you want me to do what? Are
Exactly.
things that 25 or 30 years ago, no layperson would have been doing at home. People would have been getting that care in a hospital or, medical setting. And there's been this like cost cutting, but like the cost falls somewhere and it falls on families who, have to do this work without that much support or training. So I think some healthcare reform could do an immense amount for caregivers and for patients.
You mentioned that it's really it's not a political party issue. It's it's a humanity issue,
Mhm.
which I'm hoping that they can all agree on. And then you talk about how, yeah, we're expected to do these things. I remember it blindsided me one time when we were trying to find care for my mom who was diabetic. And you can get somebody from home health care to come in and, sit with her 4 hours a day, but they weren't allowed to do the insulin injection. And I'm like, well, why am I allowed to do why could I do the insulin injection as a family caregiver? And here it is, like, you're more trained than I am. It just was so absurd to me. Yeah. And so some of them would do that, under the table. It's like, we can't go
Mhm.
anywhere if we can't get anybody to do these injections. I mean, she needed them four
Yeah.
hours a day, 4 times a day, rather, not 4 hours. Um,
Mhm.
but it's just, yeah, a lot. And to your point, like, there's a lot of times you're like, I cannot believe I'm doing this. And luckily I have siblings. We could laugh about some of the situations we had to get ourselves in.
Mhm.
That's how you stay sane. Where did you find help? Family, or how did you learn to ask for help?
Well, we did have family. My husband's parents, as I mentioned, like really generously dropped their lives in Canada and came to be with us. I remember it was hard to ask for that at first. The very first time Brad went into the hospital, it was with a burst lung tumor. And this was at the very outset, like when his cancer first turned aggressive. And he was in the hospital about a week and his lung had collapsed and he was not doing great. And it looked like, he might be headed to the ICU. And I was scrambling. It was like that end of the school year when every kid needs like a poster board and a school project. And I remember being up late once, like ordering a plastic lobster on Amazon for my daughter's like state float because she was representing Massachusetts. And I'm like, I need to go to bed. I was just so like overstretched. And I think both of us were a little reluctant to reach out to my mother-in-law, not because we didn't want her help, but because we didn't want to like bother or impose. And I'll never forget, it was May, and on the Saturday, it was Mother's Day weekend. On Saturday, I'll probably tear up while I'm talking about this. My husband finally said, like, yeah, call my mom. I want my mom.
Aw.
And so it was late when I got home from the hospital, and they're on the East Coast and I'm on the West Coast. And I sent an email to her saying, like, you know, Brad is asking for you to come and I really need the help as well. Is there any way? And by the time I got up at 6 a.m. Pacific time, I had an email from her saying, like, I'm at the airport.
I love it.
And she flew all day on Mother's Day. And that was a real lesson in asking for help because it was really critical for us. But there were so many other times, I was always so moved to be offered help. And, we had community, especially around like our kids' school community, that really stepped up. And I remember one time with asking for things, this to me was a little lesson in asking for the thing you actually need. We had a meal train, we were getting lots of food. We even had to like borrow an extra refrigerator from neighbors because our fridges were so full of food. So we were really blessed in that regard. There was one woman who was like a lifting partner at my gym. And she was asking, can I bring you dinner? And it's like, oh, we're like overwhelmed with dinner. And I said, what I really need is to move some furniture before my husband comes home from the hospital. And I know you're strong and that we can do it together, but I don't have another adult to help me like move this furniture. Like, can you? And I didn't know her very well, but like, she was like, yes, that I can do. And she came over and helped with that. And that was a moment of like, Yes, like remember to ask for the help you actually need instead of the thing that might seem like what the person like what is more standard
Yeah,
or,
the
and
meal timing.
she
Yeah,
seemed happy to do it, and it was the help I actually needed. So,
so
but I
good.
think a lot of us shy away from asking for help, especially like we have a very individualistic, like self-reliant society, and it can be hard to admit when you need it, but it's really important.
Yeah, it's important, and people don't, they want to help, and
Yeah.
I think sometimes too, like they naturally are thinking about the caregiving help, but to your point, like sometimes it's the family responsibilities, the home responsibilities, like mowing my yard, cleaning the house, taking my kids to, the dentist appointment, like whatever it is, like it's one less thing on your list, and your list
Mhm.
is overflowing, and so it's you can use the help. Music is such an escape for me, and I saw at the end you have a playlist, so I thought I'll put the link to that in the show notes. We have a
Oh, great.
caregiver anthem playlist from Happy Healthy Caregiver, and now we can add the already toast Spotify playlist because yeah, now I listen to songs, I'm like, oh, that's so, I think caregiving, like the same reason you see it in your literature, is similar to me in music.
Mhm.
Did music play a part for you, like when you're in your self-care?
Yeah, it definitely did. I remember there were some songs that I would like blast and, you know, scream sing along to on the way home from the hospital, which was like very close for us, but like that little separation in the car, like just getting out of your own head and having being taken along by music is, I think, an important, it does provide kind of some escape.
I agree. I agree. You talk about support, and one of the other things that surprised me is that you found more support on Twitter, and I think maybe just share about that. I just thought that was interesting for you that you use Twitter as a way to find support.
Yeah, some. I mean, I think it can be good for finding like distinct communities. I was in kind of a little literary corner of it, but partly, I obviously, had many friends on Facebook, and I feel like Facebook has kind of shifted over from being more community oriented and like the place where people put like their daily observations or like things that they're thinking about. And it was kind of shifting at the time to a little more self-promotional and a little different vibe. And, people have kind of moved into the groups and so on. And for me, what I realized, I tend to kind of observe things with some dark humor or a little bit of sarcasm or, some of the hard things about caregiving. I didn't really feel like I could put on Facebook because that was where like my aunt is and, Brad's cousins and like people he went to high school with and all of those things were. And it's like somebody is going to take this amiss and think that like I'm really being like irreverent about like a very serious time in his care. And we were maintaining a blog about his illness and his progress during his stem cell transplant, which was really, a really tough time. And we were maintaining that as, and he was not doing well. And we were maintaining it as a way of communicating with people. And I was like, if I start posting my weird like pictures of the weird art in the hospital with sarcastic comments, people are going to think like I'm not engaged enough in his care. But Twitter is like an anonymous, like random pool of randomness and things float by and everything. That was like the perfect audience for that kind of thing. Um, there was this one art piece on the hospital grounds that I walked past every day that was like, I started to call it like the apocalypse picnic because it was like this bronze of like down to having little Oreos cast in bronze with no people. So it was it was the oddest thing. Like it looked like a picnic where everybody had suddenly like evaporated. Like
Too, because who would leave Oreos uneaten on a table?
exactly. And because it had like, in rain and so on, it had gotten like a patina, everything looked almost moldy. And I was like, what is this art for a hospital? Like this makes me think everybody has suddenly like passed away. Like, this is not like happy or inspirational. So I started just posting about things like that, and it was a little bit of an outlet for me, and a way of staying in touch with like my own thoughts about stuff, instead of just a kind of like, "Ah, I'm a caregiver," with like my, thoughts that are only specific to, the good care of my husband, which,
Right. In
we
your
have
daily
other,
reports, your
yeah,
updates, which do
yeah.
you use
So
Caring Bridge, by the way, for your blog?
we ended up not using Caring Bridge, and I can't really remember exactly why we chose not to, but I mean that, and there are now many more options as well. Honestly, I think I'd only encountered Caring Bridge in cases where somebody had a terminal illness, and it felt linked to that in my mind, and I think that's part of why I shied away from it.
Yeah. Oh, I just
Um,
asked because I know that's what we had used, and I like to kind of point out the resources people use. What else
yeah.
was therapeutic for you during, for your self-care? I mean, self-care for caregivers is so, it's not just about a workout and good nutrition and sleeping well. Like it's whatever feels like it's energizing you, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the baseline was actual therapy, which was, very important. And interestingly, I often felt like I wasn't really doing work in therapy in that way of like, I'm healing past issues. It was much more venting oriented, and just kind of like getting things out of my system. So it felt different from like, therapy through a crisis felt different to me from the more reflective kind of like working on my issues kind of therapy that I've done at other times. Um, but I think that for those who can access it, and I know that talk therapy has, significant access issues, that is an amazing resource, and it definitely was for me. Trying to get out of town sometimes, and I was fortunate to be able to do that because my in-laws and other family members were able to help. For me, I sometimes took my girls on overnights. They were pretty little when Brad was sick, but doing fun trips with my daughters that kind of took us all out of that space of illness and gave a little more sense of normal fun time. Like, I took them to San Diego on spring break when Brad was still hospitalized in after his stem cell transplant. My in-laws stayed and visited him in the hospital. But that was like such an escape, to see the ocean, to see them run around, to see them be kids, and spend that time with them was so important, and is like a really, happy memory in a really dark time.
Yeah.
So those are just a few things.
There are spouts of joy within this caregiving season. And I think it's almost more heightened because you're so appreciative of it. I know when
Mhm.
we had some travel during some of our caregiving years, and it just was like everything was like, wow, I can just so grateful for all the little moments. And I'm curious, like how has looking back and reflecting on caregiving on your two kids, like what do you think it did for them that maybe, the family across the street may not have experienced that wasn't in an active caregiving situation?
Yeah, I really felt like, so my daughters were 9 and 5 when Brad was diagnosed, and they're 16 and 12 now. So it's been some time. I really felt like, especially seeing my older one, um, it was interesting when she hit middle school. She was very uninterested in some of the more, for lack of a better term, petty drama that is often associated with middle school. And I think that it actually, not that I would ever choose this for my kids, but I think it actually did have an effect of kind of adding to some maturing at an earlier time, giving a kind of perspective. We are relatively privileged. We are very fortunate. Otherwise, they don't. My kids are not like out there experiencing a lot of hardship, and I don't, want them. Nobody wants their kids to have hardship, but I think that going through something that gives you some perspective at a young age is really valuable, and helps kids grow up, have empathy, you know, be better people in the world who understand, that everybody is going through something, and it's can be really tough. So that was kind of a little bit of a silver lining.
Yeah, I think, mine are 21 and 19 and we're empty nesting, and people will talk like, oh my gosh, your kids they just seem to have your stuff together. And I'm maybe bragging as a mom, but I'm also like, I think they had to do it because of the caregiving years. I just think they had no choice. We sat them down. We were like, you're going to have to own your stuff. You're going to have to, was my husband and I were both caregiving simultaneously when they
Mhm.
were younger. And so, putting themselves on the bus, making their breakfast, packing their lunch, like now they're in college and they're okay. So
Yeah, my
it's,
kids have both done their own laundry and packed their own lunch from a pretty young age, and they're pretty competent at some of those practical things, which is something I wanted to foster in them
hey,
anyway.
yeah, but we
But,
may not
I
have,
was
might have been a lawnmower parent, but we had a chance. So
yeah. I mean, it is tempting for sure. And I grew up, my mother experienced a lot of pretty severe depression when I was young. And so I did a lot of those independent things myself as a kid. And, sometimes would struggle with the idea of like, oh, am I parentifying my kids so that they're doing too much, leaving them on their own to handle everything. So I tried to find a balance there. And, one thing I do observe is that, they have kind of picked up that lesson of caretaking. They're understandably solicitous about their dad and his health, and that, I kind of see that dynamic. And occasionally I'm kind of like, part of me is like, I could use some help or care as well. If anybody's asking. But and since they're both girls, I kind of think about that gender dynamic and like what they kind of learned about that relationship,
yeah.
for their future. So
Yeah,
that's it.
we're trying to make a difference in the next. I remember, you say, "Oh, you're so cute," or "You're so pretty and smart," and then,
Right.
yeah, it's not just a one and done. Well, that's been fun to have a conversation. I love it's like we had our own little book club because I just
Yeah.
read the book. So, but wanted to put you through the lightning round, and these are all self-care prompts from my Just For You daily self-care journal. It was just something that I was hoping caregivers or whoever, women, anyone, just to be intentional about their own lives. I feel like we lose our identity a bit when we're
Mhm.
caregiving. So whether you write a sentence or a whole paragraph, I found writing to be very therapeutic, and I know you did as well. Um, so I picked out some prompts for you. So first one says, Kate, if you wrote a book, or in your case, another book, what would it be about?
Oh, well, see, now you've asked the question that I'm struggling to answer, which is like, oh God, what is the second book going to be about? But I do have a few ideas. Oh, obviously, I never expected my first book, to be about caregiving, because I didn't expect it to be such a part of my life. Um, I do have this idea for writing a novel set in the world of rowing, because I was rowing for a while, and it has its own like whole world of lingo, and the language around it is really rich and interesting, and it's such a beautiful like place to be out on the water. And so if I could kind of drop everything and just write something just for fun, maybe that.
That sounds fun. I think that's interesting that you picked that up as a hobby too. Um, I love that. What what energizes you right now?
um Going to swimming holes really energizes me, like taking walks out in nature, getting into rivers or lakes or natural places to swim. It's like my favorite thing to do. It's been tough this year. I live in Northern California. It's been a horrible fire season. It's been smoky. Some of my favorite places have been literally on fire. And that's hard to get through and see. But when I can get out into nature, and especially into water, that gives me like the most the most energy and so much joy. So I'm actually turning 50 next year, and I set this goal of getting to 50 different swimming holes or hot springs or places to soak, but by the time I turn 50. So I'm like seeking that out.
Well, I love that. Well, I'm a big bucket list person, and I also I have a more fun in 21 list, so 21 things in 2021. And that's part of what I, coach caregivers on, because I think even just little things that they want to do. So I love that you have something intentional that you're working toward. I just turned 50 last month. It's okay on the side. I think it's fun to kind of mark it in a special way. And
Yeah,
life after 50, so far, so good.
excellent. I'm glad to hear a report from the other side. I
Yes.
turned 49 next week, so I've got a year to
Happy
get
birthday.
there. So
Yes. Yeah, celebrate all month for sure. Um, let's see. We kind of hit on this one already. Name a person that inspires you right now.
oh gosh, I'm gonna blank and freeze on this right now. Um,
Or maybe you could change it to say, like, how do you spark your creative side? Like, to get, because as a writer, like, you got to get your juices going. And what sparks your creative?
I mean, reading really sparks my creative juices. I recently read and found really inspirational and interesting Maggie Shipstead's The Great Circle, or not it's just Great Circle. Amazing novel, like big, epic, sweeping novel with a historical and a contemporary narrative. And it just kind of took me into another world. A lot of it is set around aviation in like Prohibition era Montana. And then in the same area of the country, I read Jess Walters' The Cold Millions, and that's in like the Spokane labor struggle of the early 20th century. And it's a novel and these just kind of like open up different worlds in a way that I find really, really thought provoking. And then read a book I've been thinking about, the color blue and some descriptions of blue in a book that I'd read. And so I'm wrestling with that, and read a history of the color blue and its symbolism that was like, just kind of blew my mind, like, as it were. And
Gretchen Rubin, I don't know if you follow her. I love the Happier podcast, but
mhm.
she did a lot of study on color, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. And to return to the original question, right now I'm really I've been following a lot the work that Anne Helen Peterson is doing. She's focusing a lot on care and care issues in her newsletter Culture Study, and I find that really kind of interesting and inspiring. And she talked to me, but wrote a big piece about elder care that for Vox that was great. And she's really engaging with a lot of issues around burnout and like invisible labor in our society that I think are just so important to have those voices raised.
I love it. I'm going to check her
Yeah.
out. Make sure that we'll link to all this stuff in the show notes. And where do people connect with you, find out more about you? And is there anything else that you wish we had touched on that we didn't hit on today?
Well, I'm on Twitter, on Instagram. My handle is Washington Kate on both places. I have a website that has my full portfolio. I have done so many different kinds of writing and essays that are not just about, not just around caregiving. A lot of my background previously was as a food writer. So up until the pandemic, I was a restaurant reviewer in my city in Sacramento. So I've written a lot about food. I've developed recipes, and I'm not publishing that much new work right now, in part because I'm kind of still thinking a lot about the book and talking a lot about the book, which is amazing and a wonderful opportunity to talk to you and others who are working in this space. So my events and my writing is all on my personal website, and there's a way to contact me there if anybody wants to. And then my book is out from Beacon Press, and it's widely distributed on all of the all of the book buying platforms, and in local independent bookstores, which I will just put in a plug that for people, if they have not heard, there's actually a paper and supply chain shortage around books. So buy your books for the holidays, especially from independent bookstores, and support your local independent bookseller early if you can. So that is my little plug around books.
And I love the little bookstores, the independent bookstores. So, well, this has been such a treat, Kate, to just get to know you a little bit better. And like I said, have our own little private book club. And I look forward to seeing what you do next. And I think your day job as a food restaurant reviewer, that sounds delightful. So
Thank you.
yes, enjoy. My best to you. And thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.